ideas about well, interesting topics to discuss, interesting talks to be shared here in this forum, please let us know, because we can well, we can have a look and see whether we can make some slot available for that. Today we will have Yanan Liang, who is one of our PhD students working on the material requirements of the energy transition. And she already published her first paper and is almost, well, she's close to finishing a second paper on this material use, and she will be presenting her work today. So if you have any questions, either use the chat for that or wait until the end of the presentation, where you of course are welcome to ask any questions you might have for Yanan. So thank you all for joining. I hope to see you all also with the next the future meetings. And yeah, Yanan, I would like to give the floor to you.
Okay, thanks, Rene. Maybe I can share my screen.
Sure.
So can you see my screen now?
We can.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Rene. And I'm very glad to be here to share our current research, the demand for critical materials under the International Energy Agency's net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. And thanks for Rene and Esther for the great supervision, because currently it's still a working paper. So if you have any good ideas, comments, or questions, feel free to let me know after the presentation. I'd love to discuss with you. Okay. When we talk about energy transition, as we all know, energy transition means we need to transfer our currently fossil fuel-based energy system to a more sustainable, clean, renewable energy system in the future. Current fossil fuel-based energy system, we need lots of bulk metals like steel, copper, aluminum to build the infrastructures. Compared with fossil fuel-based energy systems, a renewable energy system not only needs bulk metals, but also they need lots of critical materials to produce like high-tech components for renewable technology like batteries or wind turbines. So with the rapid deployment of renewable technology, the renewable technology will be the main driver for future mineral markets. But it's special for critical materials. If we want to explore a new mine, it may take several years, maybe 10 years. And for critical materials, they have a high geographic concentration and their supply chain are so fragile. So this raises the concern for material constraints for critical materials, because the mismatch between the critical material supply and demand, there attracts a strong research interest in this field. And about 1 year ago, the International Energy Agency also published a flagship report named The Role of Critical Materials in Clean Energy Transition. In this report, they assessed the material requirements for varying energy and technology based on two main IEA scenarios. One called Sustainable Development Scenario, we called SDS scenario, and another we called SPS scenario, Stated Policies scenario. In general, the stated policy scenario just based on currently government policy and plans measures is far to achieve our climate targets. But the sustainable development scenario means we can meet net zero emission around 2070. And a few days later, Also, International Energy Agency, they published another also very important special report named Net Zero by 2050. In this report, they provide a totally new pathways for global energy sector to achieve net zero emission in 2050. In general, we can say it's a more ambitious and more intense scenario compared to SDS and SPS. Reaching net zero emissions globally by 2050 would demand a dramatic extra push for the deployment of various clean energy technologies. If you want to know the more details of the difference between those three scenarios, you can follow the bottom link or check on IEA's website. They have a very clear explanation. So now we have two reports. One, the critical material reports, they calculate the material requirements for low carbon technologies based on SDS and SPS. Then they provide a new scenario called NZE scenario, but without any material flow or material requirements accounting. So it's curious for us to figure out what would be the difference in material demand through those different kinds of scenarios. In order to answer this question, we did this research. And here is the scope of our research. In this research, we calculate in total 17 elements, mainly used in 3 main renewable technologies. You can see the figure.
I'm not sure, am I the only one experiencing a freeze? No, I am not, because I can see still see Paul moving. Oh.
Rare earth elements.
Yanan, sorry, there was a little freeze up in the presentation. So maybe you can go, let's say, 1 minute back in what you were presenting.
Okay. Okay. Sure. I can start with the scope of this slide. Yeah. Okay. In this paper, we considered in total 17 elements used in 3 main renewable technologies. You can see for silver, arsenic, and other critical materials embodied in PV cells and used for solar PV, and for wind turbine and electric vehicles. They all need permanent magnets used in wind turbine generator and EV motors. They also contains rare earth elements, and another very critical component for EVs is absolutely the batteries. Batteries contains lithium, cobalt, nickel, and magnesium, and other critical materials. And here is a very simplified model framework for our research. You can see the red side, the different color represents input data and output data separately. Our module separated to 2 parts. The top part is technology or components module, and the bottom part is material module. First, we use the historical stock data and the net zero emission stock data in 2050 we got from IEA, combined with the lifetime distribution. Then we use a stock driven model to calculate the prospective annual flow and stocks of the technologies and components. Because each technology may contain several different kinds of sub-technologies, so we also combined with the different market share to calculate specific technologies inflow and stock. Then we use those numbers multiplied by the material intensity to calculate the material demand every year. And again, we combine with lifetime distribution and use a flow-driven model to calculate the materials inflow, stock, and outflow every year. Here for outflow, we also considered recycling rates because outflow and recycling rates we can calculate a potential for possible secondary supply. Then we got some results. First is the technical and components level results. You can see the 4 figures. The left side represents the newly installed capacity of wind turbines and solar PVs every 5 years, and the right side is the installed capacity. It's the stock of wind turbines and solar PVs. For inflows, we can see those figures, both wind and PV capacity additions are significant until 2035, and those additions mainly for the capacity expansion. The orange bar represents the capacity expansion, but after 2045, the newly installed capacity mainly used to replace the retirement capacity, the yellow bar. As for the installed capacity for the stock, because net zero emission scenarios, they provide every 5 years data points for the stock. We use kinds of curve fitting to gauge every year's installed capacity. You can see figure B, the light color represents the offshore installed capacity. In 2050, offshore wind power accounts for near 20% of the total wind turbine installed capacity. For solar PVs, crystal silicon-based PV cells still dominate the PV market, but the share of other thin film solar PVs slightly increased after 2030. And next is also the technology level results. It's for electric vehicles and batteries. The top two figure represents the annual EV sales and EV stock, and the bottom one represents the EV batteries demand every year. We can see the left figure, annual global sales of electric vehicles can reach about 190 million in 2050. At the same time, for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, sales will decrease year by year after 2035. According to the assumption of net zero emission scenarios, the electric vehicle stock will account for 20% and 86% of cars in 2030 and 2050, respectively. But currently in 2020, this number is 1%, so we can imagine we need to sharply speed up the EV stock in order to achieve the net zero emissions scenarios target. And for the battery capacity, the total battery capacity, we also considered several different kinds of market share for different battery technologies. And the capacity of batteries over 10 terawatt hour in 2050. Okay, this is all the results at technology level. Then we got some results for some materials. First is the PV related material flows. The colorful figures, each color represents one kind of elements. In PV, we considered in total non-critical materials. You can see the positive value represents the gross demand every year, and the negative value represents the outflow for the metals. For most of the metals, their demand peaks around 2050, then gradually decrease. Take silver as an example. You can see the trend of the inflow increased and then decreased. But the demand for arsenic, indium, and gallium, their demand is increased all the time. This is because, according to IEA's assumption, after 2030, arsenic gallium PV cells will enter to the PV market, and it will takes a certain amount. This also drives the amount of those three kinds of materials demand. And for the negative values, the outflow offers huge recycling potential for PV cells. You can also take silver as an example. You can see the outflow even much more than the inflow, even especially after 2040. Here we also got some results for rare earth demand for used in permanent magnets from 2005 to 2050. And similar with the PV metals, also the positive value represents the inflow, negative value represents the outflow. But here we also add two lines. The dashed line represents, we consider a 10% recycling rate, but the solid line represents, we assumed 100% of permanent magnets used in wind turbines will be recycled, and 80% used in EV motors will be recycled. Overall, also a strong future demand growth for all kinds of rare earths. But according to our calculation, the main consumers of rare earths currently is wind turbines, but it will be replaced by EV motors in 5 years later. And based on our current assumption, the negative value of the outflow compared to the inflow is very small parts, and the role of recycling in alleviating the demand for rare earths is very limited. You can see the range between the two lines, they are very narrow. And as for battery metals, we have the similar figure for lithium, cobalt, nickel, and manganese. Also it's totally same display for rare earths. And for the demand, also for all battery materials, their demand will increase during our research period. And according to the assumption, because we all know with the development of battery technology, new battery technology will need, for example, less cobalt, but we can see the cobalt also increased, very strong increase. That's because the surging EV stocks offset the impact of battery technology shifts on material demand. And for the outflow in short term, before 2030, the outflow is very small, negligible compared to the inflow, but the total outflow gradually increasing year by year. When we consider like a 10% recycling rate, the secondary supply will account for less than 5% of material demand in 2050. But if we considered 80% closed loop recycling rate, the secondary supply will account for almost 27% of the total material demand in 2050. That's all the material results we got. Then we did compared with the material requirements under SDS and net zero emission scenario. Here, take wind turbine, rare earths used in wind turbine as an example. The rare earth requirements in SDS scenario in 2020 index equals 1, then we can have a feeling that under net zero emission scenarios, the rare earth requires much more than SDS scenarios. And the total demand of rare earths used in 2050 is more than 7 times that of 2020. And we also do the same things by PV metals as well, batteries. Here we list as tables. You can see the similar with rare earths used in wind turbines, because in net zero emission scenario, they have a greater capacity compared to SDS scenario. So all the PV related materials at the same time point is much more than SDS scenario. But interestingly, we found not all the material requirements not increased all the time. Like silver, after 2040 and from 2040 to 2050, the demand actually decreased a little bit. For batteries, for lithium is almost equal to in net zero emission scenario to SDS scenario, but according to our calculation, cobalt, nickel, and magnesium requirements slightly decrease compared with SDS scenario. But from 2040 to 2050 in net zero emission scenario, because SDS scenario, they only up to 2040, so they don't have the number in 2050. But in net zero emission scenario from 2040 to 2050, you can see all the requirements of those battery elements increased a lot, like double times for cobalt. That's all the results we got. Then we have a very rough discussion for the material demand. When we talk about material requirements for energy transition, we all worried about the materials will be a main barrier for energy transition. It has lots of challenges, but according to our analysis, it's true we have lots of challenges because for rare earths it's increased a lot. But for PV metals, we can also see kinds of opportunities because that demand not increased all the time. And another part of the discussion is because it's really hard to say something for the future. All the results based on scenario analysis I use the different assumptions, use the different parameters like material intensity changes, market share changes, or the lifetime changes will have a huge impact on our results. So I also need to do a sensitive analysis here to find which parameter is the most sensitive one for the results. But unfortunately, I don't have the results yet, so I don't present here. So that's all I want to share today. So thank you for the listening. And if you have any questions and comments, feel free, let me know.
René, je staat op mute. Does anyone have a question?
Strange problem occurred. I couldn't unmute myself. I'm now unmuted. Thanks, Yanan, for your great presentation. Very interesting work, I think. Well, of course, I should think because I'm kind of involved in it. But thanks for presenting it in a very clear and very clear way. And also, I think, yeah. It was one of the questions that popped up when we saw these reports one day after each other without any. Well, there was a little connection. There was one little graph there somewhere that said something about the net zero emission scenarios with regards to material use, but it was very limited. So I'm really glad that you did this great analysis, because it really helps understanding what the differences would be, and it's quite a significant difference also. So thanks for that. Floor is open for questions. Sebastian.
Thanks a lot. Very nice presentation, very nice overview. The one thing that I'm always struggling with is that when you present results of this type of analysis where demand goes up, it becomes a little astounding or maybe almost incredible to believe that that will sort of grow our renewable energy system without any hiccups, and so I'm wondering if you've thought of any positive or inspiring examples of stuff that we perhaps need less of. Of course, we are working together on some work related to the material requirements in fossil fuel infrastructure, which of course you will not need anymore if the renewable energy system expands. But is there a sort of a positive way also to present these scenarios instead of presenting it mostly as a challenge for the transition?
Thanks, Sebastian. A very good question. I think for positive examples, one is for example, for rare earths used in EV motors and wind turbines. If rare earths increased sharply, especially for motors, we can choose alternative technology. We can use induction motors. They are rare earth free, but they still need lots of cobalt. Not copper. Sorry, copper. So also need to careful to take the shifts. And another positive is the material efficiency increased, especially for solar PVs. The material intensity, for example, in silicon-based solar PVs, the silver intensity currently is about 20 ton per gigawatt, but according to our calculation in 2050, it will decrease 90%, only need 2 ton per gigawatt. So these things, I think, is kind of positive things can encourage us to pursue the net zero emission.
Yes, thanks, Sebastian. I think, and indeed, you of course, like you say, it sounds kind of incredible that we're going to make that happen if you look at the pace at which we have to scale this up. But you can already see that happening, right? I mean, you can already see that prices are going through the roof. Now, that might be a kind of a temporary thing. There's a war going on, and there are all kinds of supply hiccups. But at the same time, you can just see that in recent years, mining and refining companies have not been investing enough, and they're in these material production supply chains to make this happen, and that's why you see these shortages now and predictions of even higher prices, and also, well, kind of scrambling to things like in the US with huge investments from the government to make these supply chains happen also, let's say, nationally, in order to also be not so dependent on especially China in the case of the US, of course. So yeah, I can see there's a lot of stopgap measures going on. There's a lot of attention for this now. But it's kind of odd, of course, because we have been making these types of graphs already for quite some time. And to me, it feels like nobody really believed that this energy transition was really going to happen. I think that's the kind of feeling that I got from it, because if you would, then you would have invested in the mines for the materials that we would need for it. But yeah, I'm not sure what's what's hampering there, what's going on there. Any other questions? I have a question, Yanan. If you look at all these material requirements, and it's indeed it's relative, it's very large for some elements and a bit less for others. And one of the things, for example, if you look at solar cells, then you can see that in the IEA scenarios, they had the assumption that something like perovskite solar cells are not really going to have a breakthrough quickly, and that would reduce material demands dramatically, because perovskites have way less materials in them, etc. So of course we started out by making this comparison between the scenarios, and then we just follow, of course, what these scenarios say. But something that I think we can do in this paper is also to say something about, well, these technology assumptions might not hold, and if something like perovskites will become available on the market in the next 10 years or so, that would make a huge difference in material demand. So and that's what you also mentioned in one of your conclusions, of course, that technological development is always kind of uncertain, so you never know for sure what the world will look like in 20 years from now, also from a technology perspective. But do you think it would be possible to at least say something about this in your conclusions, and maybe we can even make a quantitative estimate of what the difference would be, because it would be significant, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Renee. Yeah, it's a very good suggestion. Yeah, definitely, if we use large perovskite solar cells in the future, the material requirements will have different, much different. This is also one alternative scenarios provided by IEA. Actually, they also provide 11 another alternative scenarios, because IEA also don't know the technology development. Yes, indeed, in our discussion part, I think we say several sentences about this, because use perovskite solar cells will change the material requirements, but also for perovskite, they contains a number of lead. It has toxic issues, so we also need to be careful, because currently we only based on the base scenario provided by IEA, the main scenario. I don't know, but I think it's more reliable. Yeah.
And that's the main comparison, of course, also. And one other thing that I think would be useful is to also say something about well, what options do we have to, because I think that if we would follow this path, we would certainly run into issues. And one of the things that we can do is also translate this in the additional mining that would be required to make this happen. And then you can just use what normally is used then is a kind of a scale up of the mining that we have today. Is it a factor 10, 100, or 1,000 that we would have to scale up mining, because that already shows you kind of, well, is this realistic, yes or no? And then next to that, you could say something about, okay, so if this is not realistic, so what can we do to reduce the material demand? And for example, for the batteries, we've seen in the metabolic studies also that people have been discussing, well, we don't necessarily all need to have a 100 kilowatt hour battery in our car like a Tesla has. We most frequently, I mean, if you just use for regular use, let's say a 50 or 30 kilowatt hour battery would already be enough maybe. So that is the kind of thinking in do we actually need all these materials, or is there some kind of overkill in the system and it's kind of wasted the material in the system basically? Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I will add this point to the draft. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I don't see any hands raised, so I imagine there are no further questions. I'll give it just a few seconds extra for people to raise their hand. If not, then I would like to thank you all for joining. Now, in my mind, I don't have the schedule in my head, but I think in 2 weeks from now, what will be on the program? Maybe Elise can tell me, or
yeah, I have to look it up. I don't know it by heart. Wait. Talks. So in 2 weeks, it will be Irina Patrao, strategic analyst at HCSS, and she will tell about geopolitics of material supply chains.
Yeah, and I think she will be focusing on graphite also as an example.
Yes.
Yeah, and graphite is one of the materials that we didn't study yet, so that's an interesting addition, I think, to the things that we did. Okay, well, with that, I would like to thank you all for joining, and hope to see you all in 2 weeks from now. And thank you, Yanan. Bye bye.